Son had been practicing his poem for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of him reading it out loud at the dinner table, stumbling over the word anniversary, laughing and trying again. 6 weeks of him asking me every few days, "Mom, do you think Grandma and Grandpa will cry when they hear it?" And me telling him, "Yes, buddy, they absolutely will." He was 8 years old and he had memorized every single line. I want you to hold that image for a second, because everything that happened that night started and ended with my son standing in front of me in his little button-up shirt, the navy one he picked out himself because he said it made him look formal, asking me why we were waiting outside in the parking lot instead of going in. My parents' 50th anniversary dinner was supposed to be the happiest night our family had seen in years. 50 years. My mom and dad had started dating when they were teenagers in Thunder Bay, survived job losses and a house fire and my dad's heart surgery in 2019, and somehow still held hands when they walked into a room. The party had been in the works since spring. My brother and his wife had taken the lead on organizing it, booked a private room at an Italian place in Oakville, sent out invitations to about 30 family members and close friends. I'd been told from the start that I was welcome, that my son Elliot was welcome, that we were family, and of course we'd be there. That's what made what happened so disorienting. Not just the cruelty of it, but the way it was delivered, so quietly, so casually, like it was nothing. Let me back up. My brother's name is Ryan. He's 4 years older than me, and for most of our lives we were close. The kind of close where we texted dumb memes and called each other after bad days. That changed when he married his wife Sabrina about 3 years ago. I want to be careful here, because I don't think Sabrina is a bad person at her core. But she came with a very particular family dynamic, and Ryan, without ever meaning to, or maybe without ever noticing, started shifting toward it. Sabrina's mother, who I'll just call my brother's mother-in-law, is the kind of woman who never says anything outright cruel. She's too polished for that. She says things like, "Oh, we just thought it would flow better this way." And it's not a reflection of anything, sweetheart, don't be so sensitive. She started attending family events on our side shortly after the wedding, and slowly, gradually, her preferences started becoming everyone's preferences. I'm a single mom. Elliot's father and I split up when Elliot was 2. It was mutual and it was necessary, and we're actually decent co-parents now, but that's beside the point. The point is that I show up to family things alone, with my kid, and I've never once thought of that as something that needed to be apologized for. Elliot is bright and funny and kind, and he's been loved by my parents since the day he was born. Sabrina and Ryan also have a child, a daughter named Poppy, who is 5. She's adorable. She genuinely is. But in the last year or so, Poppy had become, in the language of my brother's household, the family's star. Every event, every holiday photo, every story retold at dinner. Poppy was at the center of it. I noticed it, but I didn't say anything, because I told myself I was being paranoid, being competitive, being ungenerous about a little girl who hadn't done anything wrong. Then came the anniversary dinner. About 2 months before the event, my mom mentioned to me that both Elliot and Poppy would have a special role in the evening. Elliot would recite a short poem he'd write himself, and Poppy would present a bouquet of flowers to my parents during the toast portion. I thought that was sweet. Elliot was over the moon. He spent a weekend drafting the poem with a seriousness I found both hilarious and deeply moving, crossing out words and asking me how to spell devotion. We drove to Oakville that evening in October, Elliot in his navy shirt, me in a green wrap dress I bought specifically for the occasion. The drive was about 40 minutes, and Elliot recited his poem twice from the back seat. It was good. It was genuinely surprisingly good. Simple and sincere in a way only a kid's writing can be. Something about how his grandparents' love was like a lighthouse, how it showed everyone in the family where home was. We pulled into the parking lot of the restaurant around 6:05, 15 minutes before dinner was set to start. I could see cars I recognized, my aunt and uncle's SUV, my cousin's hatchback. People were already inside. I texted my mom to say we'd arrived, and she came out to meet us. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw her face. My mother is not a subtle woman. She wears her emotions plainly, and right then she was wearing something I could only describe as reluctant. She hugged me. She crouched down and hugged Elliot. Then she stood up and said, very quietly, "Sweetheart, I need to tell you something before you come in." I felt the back of my neck go cold. She told me, and I want to quote this as closely as I can remember it, because the phrasing mattered, that the program for the evening had been restructured. that Sabrina and Ryan had worked hard on the flow of the night, and they'd decided to simplify the children's portion, that Poppy would be doing a little performance, a short song she'd learned, and it was going to be the children's moment, and they thought it would be cleaner to just have one child featured rather than two. She said they'd meant to tell me sooner. I stood there for a moment. Cleaner, I said. My mom looked at the ground. Does Elliot know? I asked. She shook her head. I looked down at my son. He was watching me, reading me the way kids do when they sense that something is wrong but don't have the language for it yet. He had his little paper folded in the inside pocket of his jacket. He put it there himself before we left the house because he wanted it to be ready. Okay, I said. And I don't know why I said okay. Shock, maybe? Or the deeply ingrained reflex to not cause a scene. We'll just go in and enjoy the dinner. My mom put her hand on my arm and said, and I will never, as long as I live, unhear this. Actually, Ryan and Sabrina thought it might be less awkward if you and Elliot sat at the side table, with the Hendersons. The Hendersons are family friends. Nice people. Completely peripheral to my parents' immediate family. She didn't say, instead of the family table. She didn't have to. Less awkward. For whom exactly? I didn't cry. I came close, but I didn't. I said I needed a minute, and I walked back toward our car with Elliot's hand in mine, and I crouched down in front of him in the parking lot, and I told him, in the gentlest way I knew how, that the plan had changed and he wouldn't be doing his poem tonight. He didn't cry either. He got very still in that way. He does sometimes, the way that breaks my heart more than tears would. He looked at me and said, "Did I do something wrong?" "No," I said. "You did absolutely nothing wrong. Your poem is perfect, I promise." He nodded slowly. Then he reached into his jacket and took out the folded paper and looked at it, and then he carefully folded it again and put it back. I texted my brother. "We got the message from Mom. I think we're going to head home," he replied in 3 minutes. "Probably for the best. It was getting complicated. We'll celebrate with you guys separately, probably for the best." I sat in the driver's seat of my car and stared at that message for a long time. Elliot had his seatbelt on. He was looking out the window at the restaurant entrance, where I could see the warm light coming through the curtains of the private room, the silhouettes of people laughing. My phone rang. It was my dad. I almost didn't answer. I thought it would be him relaying the same message more gently, patting it with apologies. But something made me pick up. He said, before I could say anything, "Where are you?" I said. "In the parking lot, Dad. We were just heading. Do not move that car." His voice was quiet and completely steady. I'd heard that voice exactly once before in my life, when I was 17 and a boy at school had been spreading rumors about me and my dad had found out. It was not a loud voice. It was the voice of a person who has made a decision. "Dad, give me 2 minutes." He hung up. I looked at Elliot. Elliot looked at me. "Was that Grandpa?" he asked. "Yeah, bud." "Is he coming outside?" "I think so." We waited. Elliot unfolded his poem in his lap and read it quietly to himself, not performing it, just reading it like you reread something you'd written to remember why you wrote it. I watched him and felt my chest do something complicated. The restaurant door opened and my dad came out. He's 71 years old and he had a hip replacement 2 years ago, and he does not move quickly, but he moved with a kind of purpose I hadn't seen in a long time. He was still wearing his suit jacket. He'd clearly just pushed back from the dinner table and walked out. He came to my car and knocked on the window, and I opened the door and he stood there and he looked at me. And then he looked at Elliot and he said, "Get out of the car, both of you. You're sitting with your grandmother and me tonight." I said, "Dad, I don't want to make tonight about—" "It's my anniversary," he said. 50 years. I get to decide who sits at my table." He said it plainly with no drama in his voice, like it was simply a fact he was clarifying. I got out of the car. Elliot scrambled out after me, poem back in his pocket. We walked into the restaurant together, my dad's hand on Elliot's shoulder. I could feel the shift in energy the second we entered the private room. Heads turning, conversations trailing off. My brother looked up from his seat. Sabrina looked up. Her mother, who was seated near the head of the table, looked up. My dad walked us directly to the main table, to the 2 empty seats beside my mother. Seats that had apparently been reassigned to other guests who had not yet moved into them. And he pulled out a chair for me and then crouched down and helped Elliot into the one beside it. Then my dad straightened up and, still in that same quiet voice, addressed the table. He said he wanted to make something clear before the evening went any further. He said that his daughter and his grandson were his family, that there was no version of his 50th anniversary dinner at which they were not seated at his table, and that if anyone found that uncomfortable, they were welcome to sort out their own transportation home. He said it without looking at anyone in particular. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't use anyone's name. The room was very quiet. Sabrina's mother opened her mouth and then closed it. My brother stared at the tablecloth. Sabrina picked up her wine glass and put it back down without drinking. My mom, who had come in behind us and was now standing near the door, pressed her fingers to her lips. I think she was trying not to smile, or trying not to cry, possibly both. My dad sat down next to my mom, reached over and took her hand. He looked at Elliot and said, "I hear you've got something prepared for us tonight." Elliot blinked. Yeah. Yes, I do." "Well," my dad said, "I'd like to hear it. After dinner, you and I are going to find the right moment, and you're going to read it to us. Okay?" Elliot looked at him for a long second. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and patted the folded paper once, like he was checking it was still there. "Okay, Grandpa." Dinner was, to say the least, an interesting experience after that. My brother barely spoke to me. Sabrina spoke to me with the careful pleasantness of someone defusing a bomb. Her mother spoke to no one at our end of the table for most of the meal. The other guests, cousins, family friends, seemed to sense that something had shifted and mostly kept the conversation light and warm in the way Canadians do when they want to collectively move past a moment without dissecting it. My parents' friends from their old Thunder Bay neighborhood, a couple in their mid-70s who'd driven 3 hours to be there, talked to Elliot for most of the main course and told him he had wonderful manners. He lit up. After the dessert plates were cleared and the champagne was poured, my dad stood up and clinked his glass. He gave a short speech about 50 years, about how the secret to a long marriage is not never fighting, it's choosing, every morning, to still be in it. He talked about the house fire. He talked about the hospital. He talked about the grandchildren who'd arrived along the way. He mentioned Elliot by name. He said that the young people at this table were the continuation of everything he and my mom had built, and that every one of them deserved to feel that. Then he said, "My grandson has something he'd like to say." Elliot stood up from his chair, unfolded his paper with both hands, and cleared his throat in this little formal way that made half the table smile before he'd said a single word. He read his poem. It took maybe 2.5 minutes. His voice was steady except for one moment near the end when he got to the lighthouse line where it wavered just slightly. When he finished, my father, who had survived a heart surgery and raised 2 children and built a business from nothing and is not by nature a crier, had tears on his face. My mom made no effort to hold hers back. She reached across the table and took Elliot's hand and told him it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard at any dinner she'd ever attended. I looked at my brother during this. He was watching Elliot with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between regret and pride that had nowhere to land, like an emotion that had arrived at the wrong address. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt hollowed out and grateful at the same time, which is a combination I don't have a clean word for. Hollowed out because you can't go through an evening like that without reckoning with what it means. That the people you grew up with are capable of sidelining you and your child and calling it logistics. Grateful because my father, at 71, in his good suit, had walked out of his own anniversary dinner to find us in a parking lot. On the drive home, Elliot fell asleep in the backseat about 20 minutes outside of Oakville, the folded poem still in his jacket pocket. I drove the rest of the way in silence, thinking about what my dad had said before we left for the night, when he'd hugged me at the door and held on a little longer than usual. He said, "I'm sorry it took me this long." He didn't explain what he meant. He didn't need to. I've thought about that sentence a lot in the weeks since. I've thought about all the smaller moments that preceded that evening. The holiday gatherings where Elliot had been talked over, the family group chats where my contributions disappeared into the scroll, the slow drift of a family center of gravity toward a daughter-in-law's preferences. None of those moments were as visible as a parking lot at dusk. None of them had a clear enough shape to push back against. My dad saw the shape that night, and he chose. I'm not ready to have a full conversation with my brother yet. I'm not sure what that conversation would even look like, or whether Sabrina would be part of it, or whether her mother's fingerprints would somehow end up on it too. What I do know is that my boundaries are clearer now. Not hostile. I don't want to blow up my family, but clearer. Elliot will not be seated at the side table. He will not be the child who gets quietly shuffled out of the frame. My mom called me 3 days later. She apologized. Genuinely, I think in the way people apologize when they've had time to sit with their own behavior and it hasn't gotten any more comfortable. She said she should have called me the moment she found out about the change to the program. She said she was ashamed that she hadn't. I told her I appreciated that. And I meant it. My dad texted me a photo the next morning. It was a picture he'd taken at the table without me noticing. Elliot standing with his poem, my parents on either side of him, all three of them looking at the paper. Elliot's face in profile, serious and careful, the way he looks when something matters to him. My dad had written one line below it, lighthouse. That photo is on my refrigerator now. Elliot walked past it this morning on his way to school, stopped, pointed at it and said, "That's a good one, Mom." It is. It really is. There's a photo on my fridge right now of Elliot standing at a dinner table, poem in hand, my parents on either side of him. My dad texted it to me the morning after with one word underneath. Lighthouse. I've walked past it every day since and I still can't look at it without feeling something catch in my throat. I've been turning the whole evening over in my mind, trying to understand how we got there. Not the logistics of it. I understand the logistics now, I think. I understand that a slow accumulation of small choices, none of them dramatic enough to name at the time, had led to a moment where my son and I were standing in a parking lot in October while the lights of a family dinner glowed through restaurant curtains. That doesn't happen overnight. It happens the way a foundation shifts, gradually, quietly, until one evening you notice the floor isn't quite level anymore. What I keep coming back to is what my dad said at the door when we were leaving. "I'm sorry it took me this long." He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain what he was apologizing for, because we both already knew. It was an apology for all the times he'd seen something off and let the moment pass. For all the smaller evenings before that one. I've been thinking about how much courage it actually takes to say that. Not, "I'm sorry you feel that way." Not, "let's just move past it," but a plain, clean acknowledgement that the silence had been too long. I think about Elliot and the way he refolded that poem and put it back in his pocket when I told him the plan had changed. He didn't argue. He didn't fall apart. He just got quiet in that way of his. And then he asked if he'd done something wrong. That question. That specific question from an 8-year-old is the clearest possible measure of what it costs a child to be made to feel like an afterthought. Kids don't ask, "Did I do something wrong?" when the world makes sense to them. They ask it when the adults around them have stopped making sense. And that, I think, is where the real reckoning lies. Not in the drama of a parking lot, not in the silence of a dinner table after my father spoke, but in what we owe the children who are watching us figure out who we are. Elliot was watching me that night. He watched me absorb something painful and try to carry it quietly. He watched his grandfather make a different choice. Both of those things are part of what he's learning about how people can behave when things get hard. I don't want to raise a kid who swallows unfairness and calls it keeping the peace. I also don't want to raise a kid who mistakes cruelty for power. What I'm trying imperfectly to model, is someone who can tell the difference between a problem that needs patience and one that needs a clear line. Someone with the judgment to know which is which, and the spine to act on it. My dad showed Elliot something real that night. So did the poem. 6 weeks of work, one moment of being told it didn't fit, and then, when the moment finally came, he stood up and read every line anyway. That's what I want him to carry. Not the parking lot, the lighthouse.